Hello, friends. This is Gabriel. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. So glad you have joined me for the top 5 Quran translations with a grain of salt. I add that because how do you actually judge a Quran translation? I'll be speaking more about some of the questions and complications regarding that. But first, please take a moment to like this video and to subscribe to this channel. That really encourages me to keep going. Thank you so much for that. Right, with a grain of salt, because how can you actually judge if a Quran translation is better or worse than another? For many, this is a theological, religious question. There are some who would say, listen, authoritative and authentic translation of the Quran can only come from a believer who is thinking theologically about the text. Some Quran translations make that explicit. Some would even say that you have to be the right kind of believer, because if you're from the wrong sect or group of Islam, that would also render your translation inauthentic. But even if you're taking the question only from a literary perspective, there are a million questions that could affect your judgment in terms of the validity or attractiveness of a translation. For example, whether you focus on the source language or the target language, your own ideas of aesthetics, that is the beauty of the language, of rhetoric, your own ideas about how to understand, for example, references that might have biblical flavor or that could be theologically controversial. Okay, but nevertheless, all of that is a caveat. Here are the top 5 translations from my humble perspective. In fact, as I share my screen with you, I'll just say that these aren't really like ranked in terms of comprehensive standards, but only in terms of things that I find interesting. Off we go. I'm going to give you a list of 5, and then I'm going to focus a little bit on the top 3. Number 5, Alan Jones' translation of the Quran. Here you have it. This is not very well known. I don't see it referred to often. I don't know what the reason for that is exactly, but it's a beautiful translation by an Oxford professor whose eloquence shows through in the English text, including the consistency with which he uses words. In addition, there's a nice feature here that he uses a superscript S or P to indicate if a word is second person singular or plural, which of course in Arabic is distinct and is very important because it could differentiate between whether a divine address is to the prophet in particular or to a larger group, the believers, all of humanity, etc. Whereas in English, we just, at least modern English, we just have you and you. Okay, so that's number 5. Number 4. Ali Kulli Qara is the Quran with phrase-by-phrase English translation. This is a favorite of mine that I used in the Quran and the Bible by Yale University Press, which you all should buy. Nevertheless, here is the Arabic English version of this translation. I just love the formatting of this. I find it extremely useful for those, especially students, who want to work on the Quranic Arabic but have the translation handy. You see how it's done in a vertical format there, and also the focus on the target language by thinking through larger phrases or idioms or expressions according to their English equivalents instead of going word by word. Okay, number 3. I'm not going to say much about this right now because I'm going to return to it, but this is Muhammad Assad's translation of the Quran. Super heavy, at least the version I have. Muhammad Assad was born Leopold Weiss, from a Jewish background. Very, very interesting story, and his translation also is exceptional. I'll get back to that in a moment because I'm going to focus on the top 3. And then number 2, Droj's the Quran in New Annotated Translation. I have a well-worn paperback version, but there's also a nice hardcover version of this, and I'll be speaking a little bit about Droj's translation in a moment. And then finally, number 1, this is a dramatic pause. Arbery's The Quran Interpreted. This is an oldie but goodie, a classic translation. In fact, this version I have, again, a paperback version, although there are very beautiful hardcover versions of Arbery's translation. I wrote a little note when I bought it. It was in September 1996 in some bookstore in downtown New York City. I can't remember which one. One of the famous old used bookstores. It was already used. In addition, I have was published in 1955. So I'll be speaking about that in a moment as well. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the top 3, just say a couple of words about each of them with some examples, and that will be it. Okay, so back to number 3, Muhammad Assad, as I mentioned, born Leopold Weiss. Very interesting story to his life, was influential in the early years of the state of Pakistan. had some controversies because of his rationalizing tendencies in his Quran translation. I just thought I'd show two of those. One, very often he questions whether miracles are to be interpreted as they usually are. So here's a verse, Quran Al-Imran, verse 49, about the miracles of Jesus. And you might note here that for the formation or the creation of a bird from clay, as it's usually understood, so here in the Arabic, where we read, etc., etc., he writes, I shall create for you out of clay, as it were the shape of your destiny. And so he doesn't see this as a creation of a bird, but tayr, because of the way auguries were done in pre-Islamic Arabia, he connects that to seeking out someone's destiny. Another example is from Al-Ma'idah, verse 111, where the word hawariyun is not translated as disciples or apostles, as it usually is, but as the white-garbed ones. Now, in the tafsir, we often find that hawariyun are explained to be men who either wore white clothing or were known for their work as dyers or fullers or bleachers of cloth to make them white. But if you read the footnote for this verse in Assad's translation, he will say, well, actually, the story is that most likely Jesus's apostles were members of the Essene community who were known to wear white. This is a community connected with the site of Qumran. Okay, so that's Assad. I'll say a few words now about Droj. Here we have an example from Quran chapter 5 towards the end. This corresponds with something we saw from Muhammad Assad. So I chose this in part just to show the contrast. So he does, Droj, say disciples here, but I really wanted to point out how useful Droj's footnotes are. So you see references to other passages of the Quran that are connected. You see references to biblical material or para-biblical material. Here, for example, the creation of a bird from clay, and he does say it's a bird, is referenced with the reference to the infancy gospel of Thomas, which can be very useful if you're looking for the Quran's biblical subtext. And here we see a reference to the canonical gospels in explaining why the Quran speaks of a table coming down to the apostles of Jesus from the sky. He says Christian Eucharist, Lord's table. It may refer to the feeding miracles in the Gospels, and he gives various details like this. He also gives alternatives to his translation. So satisfy our hearts or put our minds at rest, a more idiomatic, elusive translation. And for the first and last of us, again, he gives an idiomatic option, which is for all generations of us. And finally, Arthur Jeffrey. I just want to give you, I said Arthur Jeffrey, I meant Arthur Arbery, of course. I wanted to give you one example of the beautiful, aesthetically sensitive nature of his translation. And Arbery has long been admired for this. Some translation websites will include only Muslim translations, except for Arbery will be sort of the one exception, because he's always been seen as a translator, although non-Muslim, who was sensitive to the aesthetics or the beautiful characteristics of the Quran. So here we have Quran 101, or Al-Qari'ah, in which he translates the clatterer. What is a clatterer, and what shall teach thee? What is the clatterer? The day that men shall be like scattered moths, and the mountains shall be like plucked wool tufts. Then he whose deeds weigh heavy in the balance shall inherit a pleasing life, but he whose deeds weigh light in the balance shall plunge in the womb of the pit. And what shall teach thee? What is the pit? A blazing fire. So it's just an attractive translation on literary grounds. I did want to point out one exceptionally interesting translation, which is this bit here, womb of the pit, which is Ummuhu Hawiyah. So it literally is his mother is the Hawiyah. And I think Droj translates this verse something like that. But the imagery is eloquently and artistically presented with this translation of womb of the pit. Okay, well, despite the fact that I refer to Arbery as Arthur Jeffrey, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for spending a couple of minutes with me on exploring the Quran and the Bible. And a final reminder, please take a moment to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much.